Welcome to the Smoke and Rope podcast. Today we are on episode 40. That's 40 weeks in a row, and we're super excited to have Carol Siemon, the Ingham County prosecutor of my county, Ingham County, where I live, where I grew up, and where my business is. I'm super excited. We all are to have you on. Thank you, Carol, for being on.
Thank you. Should I go ahead?
No, one second. We appreciate it. I'm gonna introduce Kevin also in Ingham County in Lansing as well at Truu Cannabis. Kevin, thanks for being on today.
Yeah, to talking to the prosecutor today. That should be cool.
Yeah. And Tom up in Kalkaska, but a former Ingham County longtime resident.
Yep.
Tom Beller. Thanks, Tom.
Hey, good afternoon. Got my winter cap on because it is snowing in Kalkaska.
Oh man. Well, I'll be staying down here. So I'm excited. I did bring out my Carol Siemon, Ingham County prosecutor shirt. So I first met Carol, started at a lot of the fundraisers for, I guess, both of our good friend now, Dana Nessel, and was listening and listening to Dana talk about her, and then started doing more research. And I've been starting to get a lot involved in a lot of political campaigns, and I didn't know in 2016 about it. I was still on federal probation, and had a lot of issues going on, and I feel like I just totally lucked out. Through my good buddy Bob Dory, I got to know Carol a little bit better. Came to a lot of some of the fundraisers, and now my good friend Judge Giddings as well. So. It's an awesome little legal mind group, and I've learned so much. But one of the things I was really excited about, and I brag about, was that Carol was the only prosecutor out of 83 in the state to endorse Prop 1. And I remember when you told me you were going to do that, Carol, I was so excited, and it meant so much to us. And I know you did it because it was the right thing to do. And then I've been watching in the news. I brag it up. People will ask me, Ryan, do you want to move here? Do you want to move here? And I'm like, I will not move out of Ingham County because of my prosecutor, and because I won't move out of state because of my attorney general now, because I had so much PTSD from 3 or 4 years in my life where I was getting followed by cops every day, had helicopters every day, and raids, and pulled over and shaken down, and it really shook me up. And now I finally feel like I'm through that, and I lay a big part of that is being in Ingham County with Carol, and also with Dana Nessel. So with that, Carol, thank you for being on. We'd love to learn more about how you early career and how you became prosecutor, and then we can talk about all the cool stuff you're doing.
Oh, okay. So I've been a lawyer for 40 years this year. I grew up in Lansing as well. I decided in 8th grade I wanted to be a lawyer, but not because I knew what it meant, just because I was a girl, and in the 60s, girls were nurses, teachers, secretaries, housewives, and I wanted to do something else. And I was kind of afraid of blood, so I decided that instead of being a doctor, I'd be a lawyer. But that really was the original level of my knowledge. I grew up watching Perry Mason, so I knew I'd never be a prosecutor. In fact, I remember when I was in law school in Boston on Beacon Hill making a comment to someone, I could never be a prosecutor. And then about a year and a half, 2 years later, I was an assistant prosecutor. So I came to it because I originally, when I went to law school, I was going to do civil rights law, especially women's issues, sexual harassment, sexual assault. And then I realized I don't have the attention span for federal lawsuits that can go on for like 5 years or more. And so I decided to come back to Michigan, and I was going to be a public interest lawyer. I wasn't quite sure what that meant, but I'd worked for Pergam as an intern when I was in college. So public interest research group in Michigan. So I knew I wanted to do cool stuff that benefited people. So how I came to prosecution was I started as a law clerk to Judge Giddings. And we were working on a number of really progressive things. For example, arranging for women to have visitations with their children in prison, and other things that were not typical. And I was watching what was happening on domestic violence cases, and I was doing volunteer work with what was in the Council Against Domestic Assault. So I went to prosecution in 1983 on behalf of domestic violence victims. That's how I decided to come into prosecution. But once I was doing it, and I did it for over 11 years, I realized there were huge disproportionate results, that there were ways that different people of different race were being treated, people different economic situations, juveniles. I started seeing real scary patterns when it came to things like driving while license suspended and who ended up, just getting dragged into the system very deeply. Um, so at any rate, I did that for 11 years. I worked a lot in child protection, child abuse, sexual assault. And I was really dismayed with the whole system response, and so I decided to leave the prosecutor's office and go to state. And I did work with almost every branch of state government, state court administrative office, legislative, worked for Prosecuting Attorneys Association, DHHS. And then I realized that I really wanted to come back to the local level. That's where you can really impact the most. Can I keep talking? Because I'll segue to how I became the prosecutor. I never planned to be the elected prosecutor. It just wasn't on my agenda. But after my predecessor was arrested, I started getting people emailing, calling, texting me and saying, "Are you going to run? Are you going to run?" And I said, "No, no, no." And then, I said, "I just want someone progressive to run." And at some point, I realized that had to be me. So I didn't do it because I thought I always wanted to do it. And frankly, it's a really tough job. But it was really important to me that somebody who had the diverse experience, like that I know the national level issues and I know state level issues, and that I wanted to bring a policy perspective to prosecution. So I ran in 2016, and I didn't know there were other ones like me, because there are not many like me in Michigan. There are now a couple who are more attuned to that. But I was fortunate to hook up with some prosecutors from across the United States through Fair and Just Prosecution Network. And now I have a wonderful network of prosecutors in Boston and Chicago and St. Louis and LA and San Francisco and Philadelphia and small places like Lansing, where we are all looking at how to change the dynamic of mass incarceration, racism, just inappropriate and unfair sentencing.
Man, I didn't know all that, Carol. Like I said, that's a lot of times, and I'll quote my buddy Bob Basore, is like a lot of times sometimes the people that make it to prosecutor or judge aren't the ones that you exact opposite is it's the people that are not necessarily dreaming of it and wanting to do that. So I'm excited that you got reelected again 2020, and was worried there for a second when you said you might not run, but it sounded like the first time you had to do it. You had to do it. So could you tell me, it was like a lot of our listeners are in the cannabis industry, and a lot of decision makers, a lot of license holders, and would love to hear about like why you decided to come out in favor of Prop 1, and you were the only prosecutor out of 83. That's super, super significant.
Well, first of all, I do try to not, go against what the other prosecutors are doing by and large. Like, we're a pretty congenial group, even though we have very disparate views. And I'm on the board now. So generally, when the board's taken a position, I don't actively take one that's opposing that. But I actually was with Josh, and at the time that I learned that some of my fellow prosecutors were putting out just incorrect information, and that disturbed me. So I came out because I felt that it was really important that there be appropriate and legitimate information and not just scare tactics. If there'd been a balanced perspective presented, I might not have done that, but I felt that it was important that someone said, wait a second, that's not what's really going on.
No, that was huge for us because, as you know, and all of us were heavily involved in the Prop 1 campaign and the journey that began for some of us, a decade, 11 years ago to get to that point, and just to have a prosecutor actually believe in us. And now we have Karen McDonald and Ellie Savat. I always say that his
Ellie
name
Savat,
wrong
yeah.
too. Ellie Savat. So it's happening. You're getting some more allies, and it's awesome to see. But could you talk about since Prop 1 passed in Ingham County, your county, like what's been your approach on cannabis arrests, and have you seen any negative consequences or positive consequences of what's happened?
Well, we're still sorting through what it really is going to look like. The Ingham County had diverted a lot of cases since going back to the 70s. So on just low-level possession use kinds of cases, my feeling, my thought, I might be wrong, was that we didn't have a lot of those that moved forward. But we certainly had the possession intent to deliver and some of the others. And so that, I think that's really changed, hopefully, the culture. There is, right now, it's been black market problems, so some violence related to people who are still dealing marijuana on the side, that I hope, as the legitimate retailers are becoming, more organized, that will end, because that is a downside. And there's been a small increase in people driving under the influence. We always had people who did that, and that's, wrong, just like driving under the influence of alcohol or anything else is. So, but overall, I haven't really heard of any problems locally. Now, there are other prosecutors who are very much highlighting the difficulties they're having, and I honestly don't know if that's a bias on their part or if there really are additional problems. And some prosecutors are also their civil counsel, and they're involved with the licensing process. My feeling has always been that, there's Laura, there's the city attorney, that this is not something that the elected county prosecutor, I'm not a business or a municipal attorney. So that, I think, has been a different issue in different places. That I have not seen here. So we're looking at a variety of things, and one will be, and I think you guys will be helpful with this, is going back, with certainly expungement issues, but also with people who are serving sentences, long sentences for other drugs, not just marijuana, is saying, are these sentences just disproportionate? We don't have a statute that allows the prosecutor to reopen the case and do a second chance review. Some states do, we may. So I'm starting the process mostly with life without parole for murder cases, but I'm also looking at a couple very long sentences for drug cases that just don't make sense. So there are a lot of things that we have in the works that are just like little pieces that we're hoping to pull together that will give us a more fair response on the overall drug process. The other thing we're looking at is, two things involving charging. One is we're looking at Baltimore's. A number of jurisdictions, as you probably know, have made decisions just not to charge, say, use amounts of cocaine, heroin, even, meth and some other things. We have done use amounts of cocaine and marijuana for years. Cocaine just in the last year, sending that to diversion. But looking at declination or denying warrants in certain situations, if that looks like that is a public safety, promotes the public safety, which it's looking like it might. So that's one thing. And the other is trying to reduce the police contacts. It's primary because of the police brutality and the killing of Black people. But those low-level stops for taillights out, dangling ornaments, no license plate light, that are often reasons to stop someone because it's suspected they have a gun or drugs. So I want to reduce those as well. And so we're working on a policy and, trying to get input from the police too. It's like, where's public safety really at risk? And where are you making stops for loud exhaust or other things that maybe are more that you think there's something else going on? There's not a reasonable suspicion that should lead to a legitimate stop. So.
Hey, Carol, it's Kevin over at Truu Cannabis. Talk to us a little bit about, you had mentioned earlier a little bit about, having the board of prosecutors that convenes and discuss things. And you were one of the only ones that supported Prop 1. And then there's some other times, especially before we had legal marijuana in Michigan, that we had counties that would really prosecute hard marijuana arrests, and then in somewhere like Ingham County, there was less of that. How is that determined, and what authority does a local prosecutor have? Is there an authority above them that sometimes dictates policy, or how does that work? Because I'm not familiar.
Sure, and it's different from state to state. So, for example, you may remember that down in Florida, Aramis Ayena, who was a very progressive prosecutor, she did not run for re-election. There's another very progressive prosecutor who did. She said, I'm not going to impose the death penalty. I'm not going to seek death penalty on cases. Well, she's a state's attorney, and they have state's attorneys in Florida. So the governor had control. Some places have district attorneys where they actually have like a district system, and so it's varied from state to state. We have elected county level prosecutors. We're all autonomous. We're only answerable to our voters. Now, certainly we get attorney grievances, or we could be, removed for malfeasance or something. But otherwise, there's no, like, the AG is not my boss or the city attorney. We all are autonomous. We try to work together as well as we can. But each prosecutor does usually try to reflect their constituency and their community. So if you're in Cass County or, somewhere else, you're going to have a different result than you would here in Ingham County. If you're in Kent County or Wayne County, it really, but we have a great deal of discretion. We have to follow the law, but within the law, there's a lot of decision making about what to charge, what kind of plea offers to give, what kinds of alternatives to propose for, say, like a specialty court or a diversion. And it is pretty much within that individual prosecutor's discretion.
That's an interesting process. It seems like in some cases you might find some situations where people feel like they may have been unfairly treated because of the area they live in. So that's very interesting and enlightening.
It used to be a joke. I mean, and I think, but it literally happened back when I was an assistant in the 1980s. Waverly is the line between Eaton County and Ingham County. And while a crime that's committed within 1 mile of the county line can be charged in either county, there literally were people who would try to crawl across Waverly to get into Ingham County because they thought that meant, that they would be treated differently. So it is true that where you are, especially the predisposition of the judge or the prosecutor, the kinds of crimes that they take most seriously. So, for example, in the 80s, I had a hard time getting the police to take domestic violence seriously. That's thankfully seems to have changed. But so it really is reflective of the individual prosecutor, and it is why it is very important for people to really pay attention to who their prosecutor is.
Yeah, it's so refreshing to hear that that we have progressive prosecutors. Seems to be kind of a unicorn situation in Michigan, but it sounds like you're also seeing more of an increase in progressive prosecutors coming into positions around the country and even in Michigan. It's nice to know that people are looking at things like harm reduction issues, where we start treating situations not always as a criminal justice situation, but as a possible public health issue or a mental health issue or something. What are you seeing what do you see out there? Like, is there a trend towards approaching these situations differently, maybe bringing in healthcare workers instead of police into certain situations, and how do they decide where they draw the line when they approach these things?
Yeah, I think so. First of all, there are harm reduction when we're talking about drugs. There's quite a number of us who believe that it is a public health issue, and we're very fortunate in Ingham County that our public health director is also very progressive. So she sees racism as a public health issue and drugs as a public health issue, and she would say, gun violence is a public health issue. So these are things that you have a different approach. I was fortunate to go with Fair and Just Prosecution to Portugal 2 years ago, where they decriminalized all drugs back, late 1980s, I think. It's not that it's legal, but they don't have criminal remedies. So it really is a medical approach. You have people who, and we met them, who are heroin addicts. They go get their heroin every day, but they also can hold down a job and take care of their kids because they're not chasing the scream, right? You guys probably read that book. They're not constantly looking for the next fix. they're able to be contributing members of society, and and not everyone, I mean, with harm reduction, not everyone is going to ever go to abstinence. And when it comes to something like marijuana, it's like we tried abstinence with alcohol and with marijuana, and how did it work, right? Because people like to feel good, and certain substances make people feel good. What we try to avoid is harm. Is someone driving dangerously? Is someone assaulting someone or hurting someone or neglecting their child? Those are when I think someone's drug use kind of intersects more with the rest of the systems. But otherwise, really, I'd like to say, let's keep us out of it as much as possible, because it really doesn't. It's not protecting. What comes out of the drug use that's so dangerous is often the illegal sale of it. And then when the guns and the gangs and things are involved, that's not the drugs themselves necessarily. And I'm not personally a drug proponent, but I also realize that there are many different perspectives. And when we're looking at safety, let's really look at whether we've created the unsafe situations through our criminal justice system.
That's right on, Carol. I tell people. Oh, sorry, got excited. I tell people all the time. They say, you talk about Mexico and all the Mexican marijuana, that cannabis. It's been over the years, and how they built up the cartels. The United States now exports way more cannabis to Mexico than they take, and the cartels have gotten out of it because of prohibition. And same thing, if we made coffee illegal or caffeine illegal, I'm sure we'd have them getting involved in that. But yeah, actually, I wanted to ask you about the fair and just prosecution. I've been following. You went and hosted at NYU, and you mentioned Portugal, and I was going to ask you if you guys had talked about that, but obviously you went there, and I've been talking about Portugal for a long time as a way, and one of the responses I get, and I just am flabbergasted by it, and is like, well, Americans are different, and we're a bigger country, and we're different than Portugal, and it just never made sense to me. We're all human. So, what would you say to somebody? You've been there, you saw what it worked. What would you say about that?
Well, first of all, it was really interesting because we went both to Berlin and to Lisbon. First of all, I'd say Portugal is about 10 million people. It's about the same size as Michigan. Okay, so certainly the United States is bigger, but the different states in Germany all have a little different perspective on how they treat drug use. But for example, we went to safe injection sites in Berlin as well. It's not decriminalized, but it's kind of people look the other way. They have places where people can go and they use clean. They have like a kit, where they have clean wipes, and they have citric acid, and they have clean needles. They have oxygen available if there's an OD. They do have Narcan, but apparently if you get someone to oxygen quick enough, you don't even use the Narcan. They have different it's a harm reduction. And in Lisbon, we had the privilege of meeting the doctor who actually started the decriminalization effort. He's amazing. I mean, he's still very active in this. And so, there have been prosecutors in Michigan in the United States who've talked about, you probably know that Toronto and Vancouver have safe injection sites. The prosecutor in Seattle, Dan Satterberg, has been talking about that, but there's a lot of pushback. In Philadelphia, Larry Krasner really has been actively working on doing safe injection sites, but I believe there's been litigation that under Trump's administration that precluded that. So it's something that I think is, when it happens, there are a lot of people who are poised. I've talked to Linda Vale about it. I'm, like I said, while I'm not a fan of drugs per se, I am a fan of people being safe and not using drugs that are tainted, and being able to hold a job and live someplace and take care of the kids. And if we deal with these problems, they're not necessarily problems. If we deal what we now perceive as a problem and acknowledge that not everybody is going to stop using drugs, then we have to say, what can we do next now that keeps our community safe and does not stigmatize this person unduly for something that really isn't shouldn't be a criminal justice issue. If someone is self-medicating and is truly unhappy and using drugs because they're trying to medicate their mental illness or medicate their deep unhappiness, then I think we need to get people involved who can help them leave their drug usage if that's what they're seeking.
Yeah, Carol, I think it's really refreshing to hear you talk in the manner in which you're talking about these things. Obviously, you're not a drug user. You don't take that personally. You're learning this on your own accord to try to relate to the people around you out of empathy and trying to do the right thing. And I think it's really cool to hear you talk about these things that way. I commend you for taking that approach. I think it's really cool. I did have a question though. As far as your position as a prosecutor, you can advocate for rule changes or law changes, but how far does that go? So, do you have direct access to House reps and senators that write laws, or do they have a form in which you're allowed to, advocate for certain things?
Well,
How does
there's
that work?
nothing that precludes me as any individual. You know, I could put a card, do a card, go to a committee hearing. It's a little different now with COVID, but they're still doing committee hearings. Um, but there is a legislative committee through the Prosecuting Attorneys Association. I'm not on it. I'm on Victim Services and Corrections committees. And they take positions, and I have been invited to testify a couple times. I haven't been able to. I do talk with legislators. I've talked to Sarah Anthony recently just about general prioritizing of different kinds of. I mean, she's a local representative, and I have an appointment to talk with the Detroit area representative in the near future who approached me to talk about a couple different areas that she thought I might have some insight on. Like I said, I generally am not going to take a position that is at least active advocacy against what the Prosecuting Attorneys Association has a standing for, because I have great regard for the process. But I also, they know, I mean, they elected me to the board knowing that I'm a progressive prosecutor and knowing that that's an important voice to have on the board. So we hopefully do impact our thought processes. But I can, I can, as I did with the marijuana legalization, could conceivably say, listen, on this issue, like, for example, I don't believe in sentencing juveniles to life without the possibility of parole. Many of my fellow prosecutors in Michigan are still pursuing that. And I'm clear that I don't pursue that, and I won't. And I also don't believe in life without the possibility of parole for adults. But, I'm the only one, except maybe Ellie and maybe a Karen, who don't support that. So.
That's incredible. What I remember reading, like I keep bringing it up, but you went to NYU on this case podcast, legal podcasts across the country, and they've been talking about your the new prosecutor got elected to LA, and he's your friend, right? And he used to be in San Francisco. Am I correct?
That's when I met him. He was a San Francisco prosecutor. Yeah.
That's cool. So it's interesting hearing you say, because you're on the cutting edge of progressive prosecution and changing the mindset and the war on drugs and all the institutional racism that goes on with all of that in the system. Connecting with all of them, we've been fortunate to start connecting with like people like myself that maybe did time, got out, and got really supercharged in advocacy and connecting all across the country too. And we're really proud of that and some of the people that we've met. But what would you be most proud of so far in your first 5 years of office, and what do you think is making the biggest change in the community's lives around you?
Well, it's not, I'm not going to point to one specific thing. What I'm going to say is generally that we're looking at an individual proportionate response to each case. So, like, whether it's waiving a juvenile to adult court, or whether it's charging someone with first or second degree murder or whatever, or whether to expand diversion for drugs or retail fraud, it's always going to be about what's the proportionate response for this individual. Our immigration policy, for example, is that we'll consider the collateral consequence of deportation. And if you have someone who stole something from Meyer, potentially being deported is a real disproportionate outcome, even if they committed the crime. So always looking for not just like, did we have the elements of the crime, but really what is the fair and just and equitable outcome here? How deeply into the system does this person need to potentially be? So that's our thought processes that we're really trying to modify.
That's awesome.
Yeah, Carol, I read an article prior to our podcast today about you advocating for some changes in policy when it comes to driver's license suspensions and drug testing of people for crimes that had no relation to those particular issues. I remember when I was younger, I had got caught with some marijuana and got my license suspended. And then obviously I had to drive. I lived in a small town. I had to drive to a more suburban area to work. And, it's almost impossible to
Mm-hmm.
continue working without a driver's license. And then it was one of those things where, I got caught driving without my license and it
Mm-hmm.
all spiraled into me spending
Mm-hmm.
some time in jail, all because of issues that had no relation to my driving. And where are we at on that today? I've not been in any kind of trouble in 25 years, so I'm not familiar with where we stand with it today. But are we making some
Well, I hope
progress on that kind of
so.
stuff?
As a matter of fact, just over a year ago, the governor's task force on jail and pretrial detention published a report with a lot of different recommendations. And the recommendations included things like, we're seeing that retail fraud and driving while license suspended for like not complying with court judgment or non dangerous driving things, but technical things were just the main reason people were in jail. So they recommended legislation, and some of it went into effect last year. As of April 1st this year, there's now a presumption that for certain kinds of offenses, traffic offenses and misdemeanors that are not like domestic violence or violent ones, that there is just an appearance ticket instead of an arrest or a summons instead of a warrant. So what that means is you're supposed to be reducing the system exposure. Like instead of being picked up when you're stopped for a suspended ops, you would get an appearance ticket and be told you have to go to court like you would for a defective equipment or some other kinds of traffic offenses, so that you don't go to jail. So that's a huge change. We'll see how that plays out. It's only been in effect for a couple of weeks, but that means that, for example, we don't arraign, the people are not arrested and arraigned, so hopefully are not spending any time in jail at all. And then that gives us a chance to step back and look at what was their reason for suspension? Was it because they, constantly are driving drunk and recklessly and they're suspended for points, which is a different situation? Or are they suspended because they couldn't pay their court judgment or they failed to appear in court, which is Secretary of State had no option but to suspend. I mean, I had talked with Judge Boyd. He's now our state court administrator, but at the time was a 55th district judge. And I said, listen, how can we not abstract those to the Secretary of State so they don't become suspensions? And he said that's not there wasn't discretionary at that time, and now it's not going to just automatically happen. So that should be helpful for those kinds of offenses that never should have resulted in people, just automatically going to jail.
Yeah, that is progress. That's awesome. I feel like we could learn from you all day, Carol. I know some of us have a couple of hard outs, and we're really happy that you came on. Wanted to let everyone kind of say goodbye, thank you, and any final thoughts. We'll start with Kevin at Truu Cannabis.
Hey, Carol, I just want to thank you for coming on the show today. We appreciate your progressiveness in the position that you're in, and thinking outside of the box and thinking outside of yourself. I think that's what we need from all of our citizens to make this country a little bit better. And you're leading the way, and so we really appreciate it. And again, thanks for being on the show.
Tom over at Real Leaf.
Hey, Prosecutor Siemon, again, thank you so much. We just want to let people out there know that in order for more progressive prosecutors to get elected, people have to get out and vote, obviously, right? And I guess my last question to you is are there resources out there when elections come around to find out more information? Because it's not like the, for lack of better terms, sexy position people are going for elections, but it's a very important position, and it has the possibility to change people's lives. Are there resources out there when people go to the polls to know what kind of position that the person that they are voting for is taking?
Sure. And again, that varies from community to community. But for example, the ACLU does a statewide survey that's very comprehensive. And, you know, if whether someone responds or not, I did fully. It's like 16 or 20 questions about all aspects of criminal justice and police actions and sentencing and, you know, everything. And so that's a great resource. They don't endorse, but they provide very detailed information. League of Women Voters, again, does not endorse, but they provide very detailed questionnaires quite often. Last election, not as much. I think it was 2 or 3 questions. And then individual locations, we had some, like the Unitarian Universalist Church, again, did a really long, extensive one in 2016 that they published that really was philosophical and thoughtful. So it varies from your community to community, but yeah, there should be information, and prosecutors can talk about not what they do in an individual case, of course, but what their philosophy is, and it's legitimate to say, you know, what do you think about these things?
Get out and vote.
Very cool. Carol, any final thoughts for our listeners? It's been great having you and listening to you.
Well, you know, it's hard. We're in the middle of a really desperate situation right now with police brutality and racism and all the things where there's gun violence has gone up, and there's a big risk of going back to the tough on crime perspective. There's a lot of push, certain places to do that. So we have to be careful to make sure that we're continuing to move forward to treat these issues as public health issues and to have community responses whenever appropriate, and just be aware that with these things going on, we can't wait till the next election. These are things that we have to take action to say that we have to really support our communities responding to the community issues.
That's great. Keeping it local and making a difference. And I just wanted to wrap up and say I really what you talked about as far as like the ability for a prosecutor to change lives. I got a lot of us got really woken up in 2009 and 10, and after Bill Schuette got elected, the change in how marijuana was prosecuted. So we actually literally like would hold our breaths in Oakland County because of Jessica Cooper and Mike Bouchard, and try to make it to Detroit. Because they were against medical marijuana, and then even the eastern and western districts. I was a legal caregiver, and in western district, if I had been in the eastern, they wouldn't have done anything because they didn't have they had too bigger fish to fry with the other types of cases that the eastern district faces. So anybody listening, please go out there, support at the local level, local prosecutors. It's getting. We're just so fortunate, and I feel very fortunate to live in Ingham County. So thanks again, Carol.
Thank you.
Yep. And with that, we'll see everybody next week.